Hi all, I have an absolutely fascinating game of Stoofvlees to show you with the black pieces against Arasan. So this is TCEC season 16, currently in progress, League 1, round 10. So Arasan with white plays e4. So the time limit is of 45 minutes, time control with 5-second increments. We go into the Royal pairs. This is the book moves given to both. And here is the end of the book, b5. We have bishop b3, black castles, c3, and now Stoofvlees voluntarily plays the Marshall Gambit. So Frank Marshall will be very happy, vindicated that this is a really exciting and useful gambit with the black pieces. E takes, knight takes, so white accepts the Marshall Gambit. A lot of grandmasters just go out of their way to avoid the Marshall Gambit. Nowadays they don't even enter it. It's thought to be it's thought to be about equal, actually. Michael Adams has used the Marshall Gambit to just equalize with black quite often. We see here c6, rook e1. Another popular move here is d3. For example, bishop d6. This has been seen, well, there's many games in the Marshall Gambit, but there was a very exciting game, Morozevich against Grishuk, Dubai 2002. That ended in a win for white in that variation with d3. So here, g3 was played voluntarily without waiting for queen h4. Quite often d4 is played, allowing queen h4. We have this very, very theoretical line where you need to know all the theory, but it's thought to be about equal at the end of it. So that line wasn't entered into. So g3 is slightly rarer, stopping queen h4 in the first place. And we have now bishop f5. Queen d7 has also been seen before here. White's thought to have a small edge in this variation. So that's been seen before. In fact, that transposes back to the Morozevich-Grishuk game in Dubai 2002, which was ending in a win for white. So bishop f5 though here by Stoofvlees. d4, queen d7, knight d2, rook a e8. Okay, so what has black got to show so far for the gambit? We have a couple of rooks coming off, knight f1, bishop g4, f3, so a slightly weakened king, and you might consider this is quite dangerous in general, h5, h4, try and pierce through those dark squares. Bishop takes d5. Now this is where the game, or rather a caricature of the game caught my imagination, because I actually witnessed another Stoofvlees game more recent than this, and it occurred to me, it seems in my caricature version of this game, very simplified model of this game, that white has given up the light square bishop. And you might think, okay, is this, the idea is to weaken, get a weak pawn on d5 and win that and be 2 pawns up. Why not be 2 pawns up if you can? If your king can cope. So yes, an interesting idea to win more material from Arasan, which is like a rank 20 engine in the world. So why not? This is the product of brute force thinking, materialism. Why not try and win another pawn? So the more abstract notions, though, really interest me in chess, and in particular to do with bishops, actually, because bishops represent a kind of integral part of pawn structure. Bishops only visit their own colour, and we saw in the AlphaZero games the issue of the c8 bishop and how AlphaZero strangulated quite often Stockfish based on the c8 bishop. And is that the end of the story with the bishops? Is that the limit of what we can get from neural networks in terms of bishop strategy? Now here I noticed in a couple of games, and I say this is only a very simplified view, a caricature you could say, that I noticed that it seems outrageously, a little bit outrageously, that when Stoofvlees gets a bishop without a counterpart, it tries to almost establish a protected outside pass pawn, which is a lot easier said than done. And so here it will be based on winning a2. Now you might think This is totally outrageous. This is a completely outrageous strategy. No one's ever mentioned this strategy. If you have a bishop without a counterpart, try to create an outside pass pawn based on a slightly weakened outside pawn. But bear with me for a moment. It's not just this game, it's another game I would like to show you. Just think about this for a moment. If you can establish, it's a long way off here, a protected outside pass pawn, what happens to the white pieces? They get decentralized, they get locked down in a decentralized manner because it's an outside pass pawn, it's not a central pass pawn. And so your pieces would be more central and the opponent's pieces not just tied down but also decentralized. And you might think, well, okay, how on earth would this happen here that A2 would be weak for black to even create an outside pass pawn, a protected outside pass pawn? Well, let's see what happens. Knight E3, so white's on its winning the pawn and extra pawn ways. So knight e3, black ignores that actually, doesn't bother, lets it go, h5, just trying to pierce into white's king safety. White does take the time to play knight takes d5. It doesn't see the concrete dangers. And in fact, after queen e6, if white wants to just aim for an opposite coloured lifeless position, there is an opportunity here with knight f4. This seems to be just a way of at least guaranteeing a draw, basically. Even if black has a bit of activity, even if black takes one or two pawns, we would end up usually with an opposite coloured bishop and pawn ending, which is going to be like a draw, basically. And also, even on the queen e1, this isn't too dangerous for white. White ends up basically, it's drawish. So, thankfully, though, in this game, white was playing ball in terms of an exciting game to play knight e3. So, keeping things on, keeping the queens on, keeping the tension going. And we have h4, king f2, and now queen f6. And it's almost as if the kingside pressure, and I've noticed this in another game, as I say, this is only a sort of caricature version in my head, that it's almost as if the attack potential is used as a sort of bounce mechanism to try and nab the pawn, a poor little pawn, to get an outside pass pawn. This is outrageous, but seeing it twice now, I'm just shocked. Bishop d2, bishop d7. If this really is the case, this could be part of the equipment of a Marshall Gambit player. You know, sack both pawns, try and win the a2 pawn, basically. If this is the pawn sitting on a colour where you've got the bishop without the counterpart. So in theory, this pawn might be weak. So this is a long way off from proving at the moment. In the immediate short term, the light squares are painfully weak here without the light square bishop. We can all see that after queen g6, accentuating the light square weaknesses and infiltration points, d3 in particular here. We have rook e1. Just to illustrate the pain of the d3 square, if g takes queen d3, queen d1, bishop takes h2, and I've actually had to switch multiple times, by the way, in analysing this game between Stockfish and Houdini on my limited analysis for this position, because it looks as though white is going to end up, after rook takes e3, temporarily winning material, but with a stranded rook, and trying to get Stockfish to answer the question of how this rook is actually somehow liberated is difficult. It's actually easier, it turns out, and this is just my personal experience, in blockade type positions, in fortress type positions. It's easier to ask the Houdini chess engine, which I did buy. It's a really good engine. And its answer here is this bishop stranded. This is the way to go. b4, and only b4, for example, and then bishop a5 coming. So this prevents rook g5, but then bishop a5 coming, and this kind of thing is going to be okay. Black can carefully play to liberate the rook. So, for example, here there's rook takes d4, and black's better. But also in these lines, if king d5, then there's the tactical c4 check, hitting a5, and that should be just equal. So there's all sorts of fun in this variation alone, actually. How does the rook actually get out of d3? But it does turn out it's possible. So yeah, just to put that on the board again. So there's some alternatives for white. I'll put the analysis at chessboard if you want to check that all out. Another if a3, for example, this makes it more difficult for black. This would be like just a fortress. There'll be no point doing this. The rook's just permanently on d3. So the method which I think is convincing is to strike through with b4. Anyway, this is just one line with g takes h4. So let's go back to the main plot, rook e1. We have the queen going into d3, bishop c1. And now black is afforded b4, and this is commonly seen, this idea in Marshall Gambit games, where there's pressure on white's centre with b4. But it hasn't been advertised to me, as far as I'm aware, that a2 is the key thing to get, really. If you can get that pawn, then you can start brewing up an outside pass pawn potential. So let's see, rook d1, and this is where it gets really extreme to win what seems to be at the moment almost insignificant pawn. But the fact this kind of strategy of what seems to be a rampant attack being used to bounce to get an outside pawn is also in another game recently of Stoofvlees, getting h2 from what was a queenside attack, getting h2. So I'm seeing it like two examples, and I'm thinking, what is this? And I can only think that this pawn was fundamentally vulnerable, being on a bishop away from the dark square bishop. So we see here after c4 that black's going to be just one pawn down with a bit of compensation, perhaps, instead of 2 pawns down. So that's good news. If a3, on the other hand here, then taking and then queen a2 check, this is pretty incisive because of bishop b5 check, and white starts falling apart, for example, like that. And also here, if rook d2, then queen e6, and white's in big trouble here. White's falling apart. So the pawn has to be let go, it seems. So is that a big deal? White's still a pawn up, and you could argue, well, hang on, white's also got two passed pawns here, surely. Well, the bishop pair and the king position has something to say about that, the easy advance of these pawns. Queen f1, we have bishop f8, queen d3, a5, and now white does venture at least c5, and now we have a4. So we start to see the brewing of an outside passed pawn, which, if it wasn't for the other game, I really wouldn't mention this character of the game, because it seems, okay, coincidental that black is developing this asset. But as I say, the concept actually excites me of a protected outside passed pawn in terms of tying down opponent pieces and the resulting decentralization. So let's see, queen c4, b3, queen c3, we have queen b1, queen d3, queen a1, and you might think this is just ridiculous. Isn't the queen virtually trapped? Surely this is not a way to play with this queen on a1. Hasn't black, in fact, been kind of greedy? We have queen d2. a3, a form pawn is installed as well. Okay. Neural networks love their form pawns. Knight d5. We have bishop c6. Knight c3. So it's clear here that the pawns are kept in check, so to speak, because this bishop's looking at c5. It's difficult to move d5 at the moment, with the king there especially. So these other factors, king safety, the bishop pair, they're putting these pawns at bay, white's pawns, but our black's pawns permanently at bay. We see now bishop e7, and it looks as though with bishop e7 that at some points, okay, there's some extra flexibility. White, at the moment, the bishop plays an important role to stop d5, but at some point, maybe, under the right circumstances, the bishop could shift into another diagonal, potentially. But at the moment, it's playing a kind of preventative role. But there's another issue here for white that maybe f5 as well is handy. This diagonal as well could be another bouncy diagonal to think about. The h4 diagonal, h4 to e1, if f5 f4 or f5 g5 f4. So let's have a look at both of these diagonals. This dark square bishop is more active than its counterpart. Rook e1 is played. On queen d3, just to show some flavours here, bishop d8 might actually be interesting. So for example d5, but it's not, it fails. So that's why it's important, it's playing an important role here. But a3 instead, and all of a sudden the queen is pretty useful. So that kind of weakness of the last move, it left b2, so why not hit b2 harder? And this is a disaster for white. So queen d3, it's like white is a bit tied down with that queen on a1. It has to watch out for a3. So here, if b takes b2, this position is pretty fascinating. It seems as though black is doing quite well there. And also here, instead of b takes, if bishop d2, there's actually queen takes d1 and a2, and that outside passed pawn is threatening to queen all of a sudden, and in fact can forcibly queen with an advantage to black. So there's quite a few implications of the queen actually sitting on a1. It is tying down white already, you could argue, in some respects. So anyway, rook e1, we have king h8, and it looks as though this is a nothing move. What is black doing? Is black really doing anything constructive? It's not convincing, is it, after king h7 and the king going back, the queen going to b1 now. In fact, white thought that this would be advantageous to get the queens off here. If queen went back to d1, then a3 here is dangerous. So for example, yes, the outside pass pawn potential is pretty strong here and dangerous. It's too much for white. Black's getting a big advantage there. And then if rook e1 instead, a3 again. So the queen's a nuisance anyway, so white decided to get rid of it with queen b1. White is potentially thinking it should be playing for an advantage maybe, and this is the way to do it. But now it seems with the queens off, the bishops actually can make interesting use of the diagonals. This bishop is not just committed to this diagonal, it can use this diagonal, and this one, as mentioned, can use potentially this diagonal, and also sometimes potentially this diagonal under the right circumstances of, say, nudging the g-pawn away. So both bishops have great versatility here for diagonals, and also, of course, this diagonal as well. So we have king f8, so bishop e3, and now f5, so kind of emphasizing the potential impact of this diagonal. For example, you can see a quick, f4 g takes bishop h4 being useful. So rook d2. If knight a3 here, then bishop f6 is this could be quite interesting. If ever f4 is played, this would permanently weaken a central square, which is juicy for the bishop. So black shouldn't have any problems there. Let's just go back to the move f4 immediately. There's a variation of in more depth, just demonstrating what black could do with the e4 square, just for those interested. So if we have the e4 square, well, this is just a good blockade position anyway. White's definitely not going to be doing too much. So let's go back to the game. Rook d2, we have rook d8, bishop f4, and now this idea of g5, very aggressive. Bishop c7, rook d7, bishop e5, king f7, king e2, and now bishop d8. So it's interesting the use of this diagonal. And there's the lurking 2-to-1, of course, that should be mentioned. 2-to-1 over here. It's not just that white's got these two pass pawns which are blockaded. It's black has got a potential pass pawn here. But how to make that more evident? Well, the bishops start basically putting increased pressure on white's position with this pin now. Bishop a5. We have king d3. Already there will be a sort of disaster on f4 if just taking, we would have two connected pass pawns which are winning for black here. So white has to tread very carefully, king d3. And we see now bishop b7, so this bishop coming to this diagonal. And this is starting to get really nasty now. Even from a technical perspective, all engines think white's just got nothing here. After bishop b5, the bishops are really controlling white, controlling these pawns. Massive blockade. That knight pin, so d5 we could just take there. What is white doing here? In fact, now bishop b4. This is big trouble. It's almost as if white is in big trouble, because it looks as though if the king moves, well, the king did move, that there's trouble brewing with things like a3 or bishop takes c3. What does white do, in fact, here? White does seem to collapse now from this position. The aforementioned potential of creating an outside pass pawn is starting to be vividly realized. After king e3, we have bishop takes c3, rook takes c3. If b takes, again, two connected pass pawns for black with potential tempo gains, trumps white's pass pawns very quickly, trumping them to win there. So we have bishop takes, rook a7. So with the idea of a quick a3, so c6, a3, so it's white's pass pawn versus black's. You might think c7, this is blockaded. If rook takes b3 was played, then a2, this is just winning for black. So c7, bishop d7, we have rook c1. So if instead queening here, then that's just taken, and in fact a takes b is strong here. So that's just going to be it's going to just be queening. That was nifty, by the way, to stop even queen h7. So by opening up the diagonal and then queening, that's preventing rook h7 even. So let's have a look. Here a2 is also strong. So okay, rook c1, a2, and the dream has been realised. And I realise this is a massive caricature of this game, that you really get a bishop of a certain colour without a counterpart to try and nab an outside pawn to create a protected pass pawn. That's an unheard of strategy. On the other hand, we could argue that the bishop strategies in chess, bishops are kind of fundamentally linked with slow-moving targets. They only have that one colour for the whole game, and it's as if neural networks. I have this sense that they will teach us about the more fixed targets of chess, and in chess, I think we make the greatest improvements generally as players when we pick on the fixed targets of knowledge. So, for example, the calculation of forcing moves is an essential part of tactics. But in terms of positional play, what are the most committal, kind of high certainty aspects of learning positional play? I would say, the pawn structure and the relationship with the bishops, as the AlphaZero games demonstrated. We saw time and time again in the AlphaZero games the issue of the bad bishop. But what we didn't see, and I'm seeing in some games of Stoofvlees, is the use when you've got a bishop without a counterpart to create an outside pass pawn. Now this I can give you another example after this game, but as I say, they're only caricatures. For us to actually implement this in our own games surely is a big stretch. But maybe conceptually it is interesting to bear this in mind, because fundamentally you might consider a2 was relatively weak compared to the other pawns, especially the ones on dark squares where white had the dark square bishop. So it's interesting. We get this nightmare scenario with a protected pass pawn. Does this represent a reusable strategy or not in our thinking? I would say, in all sorts of subjects, there are kind of more fixed targets which don't really change over time. In IT, you have minimal coupling, maximum cohesion. It goes across multiple technologies, multiple technology eras. There are certain, what I call fixed targets of knowledge. And in chess, for me, tactics, it's forcing moves, positional play, bad bishop comes up over and over again. People learn the French defense just to learn about bad bishops and pawn structure and undermining Nimzovichian way of thinking is revolving around the fixed targets of chess. So it's what excites me about this game is this prospect of a new light on what you do when you have a bishop without a counterpart in terms of the pawn structure. So I can only give you other examples though other than this game, but what's happened here is remarkable, I think, as an illustration. So let's see, king d3, king d5, we have rook b7. So a protected outside pass pawn locks down the opponent's pieces, and they're also decentralized, which means actually with this blockade on this pawn, black can also improve its pieces more easily than white. And let's see what in particular is used. So rook b6, we have g4 and now f4, a lockdown. So white is pretty helpless here without too much counterplay. And in fact, after bishop c8, bishop g7, king c6, the king comes back to help blockade, if necessary, this pawn. There's rook b5, there's rook e1, the king comes back, so freeing up this bishop. So what can the bishop and rook get up to here, basically? We have bishop e6 without penalty. The rook is tied down to the passed a pawn. We have bishop f7, rook d1. The king blockades officially. So the rook and bishop are here to play with white tied down. Now we have rook a1 and rook d5. And white's in a kind of zugzwang here, having to let go now critically of the c7 pawn. It's kind of a subtle zugzwang. Bishop f6 just lets go of the pawn. If king d3, what happens is that black can conspire on a common square, the c4 square, with the move rook a5, with the idea of rook here and rook here and rook here. This is a devastating idea in this position. Just to put it on the board, it's an absolutely devastating idea. Using the common square of both pieces is absolutely the way to win this position, making use of the cooperation square c4. So once this happens, black gets two connected pass pawns, and that's the end of the game basically in that variation. So we have white dropping the c7 pawn, and in fact now dropping the bishop voluntarily. White's just had enough of this position, it seems, and gives up the bishop to a discovered check. If king c3, then rook d6, and again we get this infiltration potentially, or even here, if white's stubborn, white gets mated here, like this, for example. So either an infiltration c2 or the white king getting mated. So not very nice prospects there. So king takes b3, giving up the bishop. It's all over, bar the shouting, it seems. So black's a bishop up, and white's losing all these pawns. And yeah, the rest is just, it's all over. White could have basically resigned here. In fact, in TCEC, that is the rule of +10, so the game doesn't go on to checkmate. It ended here. So conceptually, the game caught me by surprise. I think we don't see the end of the c8 bishop story from AlphaZero. There are other stories, it seems, related to bishops in particular, which neural networks might be able to teach us if we're open to that. And I think that does represent a kind of fixed target of conceptual knowledge, which will become perhaps essential for all chess players to know, equivalent to, you know, prioritizing forcing moves in tactics. The positional equivalents revolving around pawn structure, bad bishops, and also the bishops without counterparts. What exactly you want to do with them, I think it becomes maybe essential knowledge. But we'll see other examples of this. I'm only giving you one example here. I know this is a bit of a claim. I would like to try and justify this claim about creating outside pass pawns, protected outside pass pawns, with the bishop that doesn't have the counterpart. Okay, I hope you got something from this. If you did, if you want to play me or other YouTubers, check out that bit.ly link. So bit.ly 2 capital Y, small v, small a, 5 capital M, capital B, all the link in the description. Okay, thanks very much.